What Ukraine did in the early hours of this morning crossed a line that Russian military planners had assumed would hold. And when that line broke, Moscow did not have time to hesitate. They were forced to respond with confusion, desperate damage control, and frantic repositioning of assets they had believed were safely protected behind multiple layers of air defense systems. For several weeks now, there had been signals, not official briefings, not formal intelligence releases, just signals that Kyiv was preparing something unprecedented. Ukraine has been aggressive, yes, but they have been predictable in their aggression. Their strikes have followed a certain pattern, a rhythm, almost a signature. Long-range drones hitting oil refineries, Neptune missiles targeting naval assets, HIMARS systems dismantling ammunition depots one by one. But what set off alarm bells in Moscow and Washington alike this past week was that the pattern went silent. Intelligence analysts who monitor Ukrainian military activity know the indicators, the movement of specialized units, the sudden increase in encrypted communications, the repositioning of electronic warfare assets, the sudden quieting of social media from frontline soldiers. All of that went quiet. And whenever Ukraine goes quiet, it means something is about to get very, very loud. Russian signals intelligence units had been monitoring Ukrainian communications with increasing urgency. They detected what they believed were preparations for a spring offensive, nothing unusual, nothing they hadn't planned for. But what they missed, what everyone missed, was that Ukraine wasn't preparing for a ground offensive at all. They were preparing something else entirely that would exploit the single greatest vulnerability in Russia's entire defensive architecture. Early this morning, NATO surveillance assets detected what they described as unprecedented electromagnetic activity across eastern Ukraine, including electronic warfare signatures that had not been observed in over 14 months. These are the kinds of capabilities that Ukraine only deploys when they are signaling something very specific, a major deception operation, a breakthrough attempt, or a strategic strike of the highest priority. Western observers didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Ukraine was changing its operational posture, and when a military force in an active conflict shifts posture without explanation, even by the smallest measure, every intelligence agency pays attention. Within hours, the picture became devastatingly clear. Ukraine had launched the most sophisticated combined arms strike of the entire war, not against frontline positions, not against supply routes, but against the very command and control infrastructure that Russia had believed was untouchable, and they had done it using capabilities that Moscow didn't even know Kyiv possessed. The assessment issued by the Pentagon tonight was not normal, it was not routine, it was not symbolic, it was stunned. Official after official, speaking after emergency briefings, described Ukraine's operation as brilliantly coordinated, technologically sophisticated, and perhaps most importantly, completely unexpected in its scope and timing. Russian air defense doctrine only works if the target announces itself. Ukraine did not. In fact, their strike today was among the most deceptive military operations we've seen in modern warfare. Here's what we know. Within 90 minutes of the first electronic warfare jamming signals being activated, Ukraine launched what appears to be over 200 coordinated drone and missile strikes. These weren't the commercially modified drones we've seen hitting oil refineries. These were military-grade autonomous systems, platforms that Ukraine only deploys when they are preparing to fundamentally reshape the battlefield. The strikes hit Russian command posts, they hit air defense radar installations, they hit ammunition storage facilities that Russian forces had moved specifically to avoid Ukrainian targeting, and they hit communication nodes that linked Russian ground forces to their commanders in Moscow. Tonight, Ukrainian military sources confirmed that their forces launched precision strikes on over 40 high-value targets, including a regional command headquarters that had recently been reinforced for what analysts believe was preparation for a major Russian offensive. Ukraine struck before Russia could execute. They hit the headquarters, they hit the associated logistics hub, they hit the fuel storage facilities that were likely preparing to support armored advances. In other words, Ukraine targeted the entire operational architecture of a planned Russian operation, not just the tanks, not just the soldiers, the nerve center that would have made it all possible. This is what made Western analysts' assessment so urgent. Russia's preparations weren't just symbolic, they were actionable. They represented the kind of offensive capability that could have overwhelmed Ukrainian positions if left unchecked. And Ukraine, understanding that fully, responded with overwhelming force, not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't waste munitions on frontline trenches. They didn't broadcast their intentions through predictable strike patterns. They hit command centers. They hit the eyes and ears of the Russian military. They hit the decision makers themselves. Reports are still emerging, but early indications suggest that multiple high-ranking Russian officers were killed or wounded in the strikes. The exact number remains classified, but sources speaking to Western media have described the casualties as significant and operationally devastating. And here's where the story becomes even more remarkable. Western intelligence officials now believe that Russia's recent troop concentrations were designed to test the resolve of Ukrainian forces. After months of attritional grinding along the front lines, Moscow wanted to see whether Kyiv would fall back into defensive patterns. But instead, the opposite happened. Ukraine didn't retreat into defensive postures. They launched a preemptive strike that was so precise, so devastating, that even the Kremlin noticed. You don't get Moscow's attention easily, but today Ukraine did. Military analysts speaking with international media under anonymity described Russia's recent buildup as probing, a way to identify weaknesses before committing to a major operation. But Ukraine proved today that they remain both capable and unpredictable. Their strikes were not only accurate, they were timed so precisely that Russian air defense systems were still cycling through jamming countermeasures when the missiles arrived. That timing matters because it shows extraordinary intelligence penetration. It shows that Ukraine is not simply reacting to Russian movements, they are anticipating them. They are inside Russia's decision-making loop. And that is perhaps the most terrifying revelation for Moscow tonight. As reports continued coming in throughout the day, we learn more about the scale of Ukraine's response. Ukrainian Air Force assets carried out diversionary strikes along 3 separate axes, forcing Russian air defenses to divide their attention across hundreds of kilometers. Naval drone units targeted logistics vessels that had been repositioned in the last 72 hours. Electronic warfare teams operating deep behind the front lines reportedly disabled communication systems used by Russia to coordinate their defensive response. This wasn't just a drone strike. This wasn't just a missile attack. This was operational deception at its finest. This was combined arms warfare executed with precision that rivals anything we've seen from NATO forces. And combined arms coordination is the one thing Russia has struggled to maintain since the first weeks of this war. For every advance they have made, Ukraine has countered with something that complicates their logistics, disrupts their communications, or eliminates their command structure entirely. Tonight was the culmination of that pattern. Tonight was proof that Ukraine has learned not just how to survive this war, but how to win it. Remember, Russia thought this war would last 3 days. They thought Kyiv would fall within the first week. They thought Western support would fade within the first year. They thought Ukraine's military would exhaust itself through attrition. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Ukraine is stronger than it was 12 months ago. Its military is more sophisticated, more coordinated, and more lethal. And Russia is discovering once again that underestimating Ukrainian resolve comes with catastrophic consequences. Moscow's military planners built their strategy around the assumption that time was on their side, that Ukraine would run out of ammunition, that Western support would collapse under domestic political pressure, that eventually Kyiv would have no choice but to negotiate from weakness. Tonight's operation shattered that assumption. Ukraine isn't running out of capability, it's developing new ones. What makes this moment so significant and so dangerous is that Russia's recent military preparations happened at a time when Vladimir Putin is under extraordinary domestic pressure. Hardliners want escalation, pragmatists want negotiation, military commanders want resources they're not receiving, and oligarchs want the economic pain to end. Putin is balancing these demands while simultaneously trying to maintain the narrative that Russia is winning. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. Ukraine's strike today didn't just destroy military hardware, it destroyed the illusion that Russia's military buildup was proceeding unchallenged. It exposed the fact that Moscow cannot protect its own command structure, even in territories it claims to have annexed. And it raised uncomfortable questions in the Kremlin about who exactly has the initiative in this war. The Pentagon statement, now distributed to major news outlets worldwide, was designed to signal that Washington is not willing to see Ukraine's momentum disrupted by Russian escalation. Officials said plainly that Russia's recent military preparations were inconsistent with any stated interest in diplomatic resolution. That is diplomatic language for, we know what you were planning and we're glad Ukraine stopped it. You don't usually hear that tone from Washington unless something serious is at stake. The State Department echoed similar sentiments, with spokespeople emphasizing that Ukraine has the right to defend itself against imminent threats, language that suggests Washington may have had advanced knowledge of the operation. NATO allies have been notably quiet, which in diplomatic terms often means they're coordinating their response. When everyone goes silent at once, it usually means everyone is reading from the same script, and that script tonight appears to fully support Ukraine's decision to strike first. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky addressed the nation in a brief, powerful speech tonight. He said, "We do not wait for threats to materialize, we eliminate them." He said, "Every command post destroyed tonight is 1,000 Ukrainian lives saved tomorrow." And he said Russia believed they could prepare for offensive operations without consequence. They were wrong. These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a wartime leader who understands just how high the stakes have become. Zelensky's tone was notably confident, not triumphalist, but assured. He knows that tonight's operation was a success. He knows that his military just accomplished something remarkable, and he knows that the world is watching. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Russia's recent military preparations weren't isolated. Along with the troop concentrations Ukraine targeted, Belarus also conducted unusual military exercises along its southern border. Russian naval forces repositioned in the Black Sea, and Russian cyber units increased activity targeting Ukrainian infrastructure. All of this happened within the same 2-week period. When Russia moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. Ukraine's operation tonight may have disrupted not just one planned attack, but an entire coordinated offensive involving multiple axes of advance. If that's true, and intelligence officials suggest it likely is, then tonight's strike didn't just prevent a battle, it prevented a campaign. Western analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Russia was preparing a major spring offensive designed to capture additional territory before potential ceasefire negotiations. Another is that Moscow was attempting to overwhelm Ukrainian defenses at a single point to demonstrate continued offensive capability. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Russia was attempting to create conditions for a political victory that could be leveraged in negotiations with Western powers. But today, Ukraine took that card off the table. They didn't wait for the offensive to begin. They didn't allow Russia to set the terms of engagement. They didn't react defensively. They struck first, struck hard, and struck with precision that left Moscow scrambling. What we're watching now is a test of resolve. Russia wants to see if Western support will waver under pressure. Ukraine wants to show that support is being used effectively. NATO wants to prevent escalation beyond conventional warfare. And China wants to prevent a scenario where Western unity strengthens further. Everyone has interests in what happens next, and everyone is watching to see how Russia responds to tonight's humiliation. Because make no mistake, tonight was a humiliation for Moscow. Their air defenses failed, their intelligence failed, their command structure was exposed as vulnerable, and their planned offensive now lies in ruins before it ever began. Tonight we've heard from intelligence officials who are now monitoring Russian military communications in real time. They say Russian forces are in disarray across multiple sectors. They say command authority has been disrupted so severely that some units are operating without clear orders. And they say Russia's decision to concentrate forces before adequate air defense coverage was in place is likely part of a broader pattern of overconfidence that Kyiv has now exploited brilliantly. But Ukraine is not celebrating prematurely. In fact, Ukraine is already preparing for the response. Their operation today, swift, surgical, and devastating, sent a message to Moscow that complacency will be punished, and it sent a message to Washington that Western weapons are being used exactly as intended to defend Ukraine and degrade Russian military capability. As the coming days unfold, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Russia hoped to achieve with their military buildup. But what we do know is that Ukraine's decision to strike first was timely. It prevented a potential offensive. It eliminated command infrastructure that took months to establish. And it demonstrated that Ukraine retains the initiative in this conflict despite all of Russia's attempts to seize it back. What happens next will depend on what Moscow does in the next 48 to 72 hours. If they escalate further, this moment will be remembered as the beginning of a new and more dangerous phase of the war. If they pause to reassess, Ukraine and its allies have already shown they are prepared. They have shown they are ready to respond. They have shown that underestimating Ukrainian capability remains the single greatest strategic error Russia continues to make. And tonight, for the first time in months, Russia appears to be genuinely uncertain about what comes next. The Kremlin is quiet, too quiet. And when Moscow is quiet, it means they are recalculating. It means they are choosing their next move carefully. Because tonight, Russia learned something they have learned many times but continue to forget. Ukraine will not wait to be attacked. Ukraine will not accept defeat. And Ukraine will strike first when the opportunity presents itself. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. Ukraine remains capable of surprising the world. Russia remains vulnerable despite its size and resources. And this war is far from the foregone conclusion Moscow once believed it would be. And we will be here, watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.